Thanks everybody for being here, and thank you all for having me. I'm super excited to be a part of this series. Had such a great time when I was here last time and want to kind of continue the conversation we were having. And I'm going to review a little bit, just a little bit of the information in case there are some people that weren't here last time. Also, I know it's a lot of information. There's not a ton of overlap, but a little bit. So we started off last time talking about what really is the impact of addiction on family members, right? And I had mentioned this sort of idea that impacts the overall sort of stability of the home, right? The entire family system. That includes sort of this sense of unity, the mental and physical health of the other family members, the financial situation, and just overall this idea of sort of the dynamics of the family. We know that substance use, misuse, addiction by a family member is an incredibly stressful circumstance, right? That impacts sort of the immediate family and then oftentimes the extended family as well. So there's a lot of people involved in the system that are impacted here. It really creates sort of a difficulty with coping and ongoing stress for all of the family members, and actually a lot of risk for physical and psychological distress for the other family members, right? Not just the loved one that might be suffering from addiction. And what I want to talk more specifically about today is some sort of coping skills, some strategies specifically for family members that they can use to sort of cope or intervene or interact with somebody that sort of might be dealing with an addiction. And also really the value of sort of support and education for those family members, because we do have a lot of research on sort of the need and value of enhanced sort of coping strategies and social support for the family members, not just the individual that might have an addiction. So what do families actually need to be able to cope? We talked a lot last time, and we won't go over it today, about sort of accurate and evidence-based information, right? An understanding really of the neurobiology of addiction, how people change, right? What is addiction? All of those things, people really need access to that kind of information. They need resources, coping strategies. And if you want to come back next time, we will be talking a lot more about some of those resources, like what are recovery pathways for family members, what support groups exist for family members. So that will sort of be the third part of the series, is really looking at some of that information. Families also need a lot of skills and actually techniques. And that's a lot of what I want to get into today, is how can family members really intervene in terms of enhancing what we call motivation to change or reinforce motivation to change. There's quite a bit of research on not only how like professionals can do that, but also how family members can do that. And I'll share some resources about that. And then family members also need support networks. We talk a lot about getting the identified person into sort of recovery pathways and sort of recovery communities, but also family members need these kinds of resources and connections, really to reduce a lot of the shame and isolation that comes along with addiction, not just for the individual, but for the whole system. So a little bit more maybe about what that family experience looks like. We actually see a lot of signs of sort of strain and distress on family members that might be living with or related to or close with somebody that has an addiction. And this can manifest in physical and psychological symptoms of their own, even if those did not exist before. And we also know that there's sort of two key factors that can influence the amount of sort of strain or distress that those family members experience. One is coping, like their own sort of internal and external coping resources, and then also the level of social support that they are receiving. So when we're thinking about, if you're a professional working with families, how are we strengthening their coping and social supports? Or if you are dealing with this within your own family, how can you increase your coping and your social supports? Because these are really the two things that can either sort of protect or make worse sort of how distressing this is to go through. We also know that family members will try to sort of adapt to the situation by coping or responding in ways that they can figure out how. And sometimes that goes well, and sometimes that doesn't go well, right? And this is really kind of, I know this is a little bit like academic, but this is kind of how we think about it, right? That a relative has a substance problem. This creates stress really on the whole family system and the family member. And you can sort of see here on one side, we have the social support for the family member. And on the other, we have the ways that the family member copes. And these two things directly are going to impact the level of strain or distress or functioning of that family member. And so those are the things that we're really thinking about, like how we can intervene around and target. Some maybe not as helpful strategies that are really normal for family members to try are listed here. And what I want to say about this is really not to pathologize family members. I think there is a lot out there really talking about things like, you know, enabling and codependency and things like that that tend to really kind of pathologize family members. And what I want to say here is that the family members are trying to cope in the best way possible, right? So they are going to try the things that they know how to do, right? They're going to likely at some point try to engage by sort of bargaining, you know, getting rid of things, maybe trying to confront them, right? All of these things are really reasonable things to try to do when you are concerned about somebody, sort of over-involving, worrying about them, like trying to intervene over and over again. We also see family members that just sort of are tolerant of it. You may hear people talk about this as enabling, but really this is just sort of tolerating it. They might just sort of put up with it. They might make some type of excuses. But again, this is really like reasonable and normal. If you have a family member that is suffering, aren't you going to try to protect them from additional consequences? Right? So we would see family members also doing this. And then eventually people might sort of withdraw, right? They just sort of detach, right? And trying to figure out how to protect themselves. Another way to think about it is really sort of through a phased idea of how family members might respond and cope. Initially, family members likely are not going to be aware of the level of severity and consequences of somebody's substance use. Again, this is like really normal and reasonable for somebody to start out here, right? Addiction tends to be progressive. We talked about that previously, and sort of happens slowly over time. So it makes sense that as that's sort of progressing, it's becoming more and more normal within the family system, and we really don't notice it and maybe how bad it's gotten at first. We have done some of those other things, right? And those other coping strategies, maybe where we're adapting to it and we're not noticing how bad it's gotten. Then we get to sort of a sense of concern, right? At this point is when we often see people sort of trying to intervene, trying to control, trying to bargain. Eventually we get to really a level of disorganization where there's sort of these family roles where everybody's sort of adapted at this point. And it might look like sort of some of that engagement and coping, right, to just sort of make the family work, to make things functional, often to protect the person that is sort of has the addiction. And ultimately, and this is where we get really that level of strain on the family, is the emotional exhaustion. Right. And this is where we start to see really a sense of like caregiver burnout, emotional exhaustion, neglecting their own physical or mental health in an attempt to help their family member. So if that's sort of the problem that we're dealing with, what is the solution? Really, the solution is family recovery. Right. And I do really, as we talk about, right, sort of recovery from addiction, there really needs to also be recovery for family members. And some of the goals of recovery for family members look like reducing isolation and reducing shame and guilt. And that comes really along with reducing isolation. So the idea here is creating opportunities to cultivate connection and hope from other families that have been through this, from other individuals that have been through this, There's quite a lot of power in somebody just knowing that they're not alone, right? That there's nothing wrong with them, that they're not crazy, that other people have experienced this too, that their response to what's going on is not pathological. It is totally reasonable. They have really been trying to use all of the strategies they know how to help their loved one. And so really this sort of support is a key ingredient. So if we think back to that sort of model, right, support groups, and that can be sort of things like Al-Anon, but that can also be through community organizations, through churches, through Hope and Healing, I'm going to guess. Lots of resources like that that are going to offer opportunities for connection to get rid of the isolation and the shame that can really come along with this. Family recovery and the things that we're talking about today are really important because they actually can be predictors of success for the individual that has an addiction. We know that family is often one of the most cited motivators for treatment and recovery. So regularly people say that they've agreed to enter treatment, or they're making these changes because of their kids, because of their partner, because of their family. Right? Not always, but often that is a really common reason that people sort of agree to start the change process. We also know that engagement from the family can increase outcomes, right? Or improve outcomes. So more positive outcomes associated with the family being more involved in treatment or sort of some type of recovery. So recovery rates increase if the treatment includes participation from the family. So that may look like family therapy, that may look like family education or family weeks or family days, depending on the treatment center, or an outpatient that may be things like family therapy. That may also be things like the family being involved in their own therapy or their own support group. But family involvement and family recovery is actually really key to the individual also sort of achieving success. So what we know, and really what I want to share with you a little bit about today in terms of family recovery, is that there are some evidence-based strategies that family members can use to engage a loved one that might not be ready to stop using drugs or alcohol. That they can actually use some of these techniques to sort of engage their loved one and get them to commit to going to treatment. And a lot of that is called like motivational intervention. So in a treatment setting, if you're helping professional, we use a lot of motivational interviewing, but there's a lot of ways that families can actually use motivational interviewing and motivational interventions outside of a treatment setting to help reinforce anything that is going on if they're in treatment or to get them to treatment. I also really strongly believe that family members can model engagement in both professional and recovery supports. So what that might look like is, being in your own therapy, right? Not just family therapy or not just therapy about the sort of person with an addiction, but your own therapy, your own support groups, looking at your own issues, modeling that. There's a lot of shame and stigma associated with getting help. And so when a family member sort of shows what that looks like, it can be very powerful. It can also make it easier to use some of the techniques and skills needed to interact with that person. And then finally, making changes to their own substance use, right? Whether or not you have a drug or alcohol problem or some type of other addictive disorder, modeling sort of that type of change can be really powerful for a lot of reasons. It can sort of just demonstrate that change is possible. It can remove that as an obstacle, right? In terms of being like a reason that somebody's not going to get help is if you're also using, right? Well, you're also using. So, oh gosh. Sorry, knocked up my water. Creating really sort of a model for what that looks like. And then it removes sort of that as a barrier. And then it also is going to be useful if they do decide to go to treatment, right? Because you're sort of making those types of changes together. So regardless of sort of your status of whether or not you have a problem, like getting alcohol out of the home, right, can be incredibly useful in terms of supporting any changes they might make later. I also want to talk a minute about self-care. I know this is like a really overused and popular term. People love to talk about self-care, but in this context, it really has a couple of specific meanings. One, tending to your own physical health, right? So oftentimes when we're incredibly worried about a loved one and a behavioral health condition that they might have, we might neglect our own sort of emotional and physical health. So this really looks like making sure you're sleeping well, you're getting enough to eat, you're getting enough exercise. That sort of tending to ourselves. Again, we're modeling that, like we're showing this is how we take care of ourselves. And that also equips us to sort of manage all of the stressors and the strain. So we think about sort of support being useful for family members and then coping being useful. Well, taking care of yourself in terms of both your mental and physical health is really sort of a foundational sort of strategy in terms of personal sort of coping and self-care. This looks like looking at your own use of substances. I know I already mentioned that, but I think that's also part of self-care. Engagement and healthy leisure, right? What does that look like? Is your whole life sort of revolving, or your client's whole life revolving around this person and their substance use, or do they have their own sort of identity and outlets for healthy leisure and activities? We're also modeling that if somebody does decide to make a change to their drug or alcohol use, they're going to have to learn how to engage in a different type of leisure, right? So what are we doing? If they do decide to go to treatment and they come home and most of the leisure that we've been involved with together was going out to restaurants and drinking together, right? Or activities that involve substances, we're not going to have much left, right? We're going to need to make a change there too. So those are things that family members can go ahead and already start doing, is looking at what their leisure looks like. I already mentioned like paying attention to sleep and exercise and diet, right? Really tending to their physical health. Practicing some self-compassion. So I mentioned like the power of support groups in terms of reducing a lot of stigma, but also support groups really help normalize somebody's experience and help them sort of recognize that they have not caused this problem, they are not responsible for this problem, and really they cannot control it. And so a lot of the self-compassion here is really recognizing that probably they're doing the best they can given the circumstances. I also think in terms of self-care, family members can make sure they are getting the professional resources to look at their own mental health, their own trauma, and their own family of origin issues. We hear this all the time about people maybe coming from an alcoholic family system, and then maybe where they had sort of a parent with addiction, and then they have a partner with addiction issues, right? That can be really hard in the moment when you are dealing with your partner to sort of manage both, right? The sort of original family of origin and sort of your family of creation dynamics. So even if your partner is not ready to make a change, like what are you doing in terms of looking at your family of origin issues or any previous trauma that you have experienced? So I would say these self-care strategies are applicable regardless of where a loved one is in terms of their stage of change, right? Regardless of what they are doing about their own substance use, like what are you doing about yours, your mental health, your trauma, and your family of origin issues? So I shared last time, and I've mentioned the stages of change, but this is really the idea of how people change, right, over time, and really an understanding that change happens slowly, right, that it is not an overnight process. And I want to kind of use this idea of the stages of change to talk about sort of some specific strategies that we can use depending on where somebody is along this really continuum of the stages of change. So this is really getting at how do people change, right? So we call this the stages of change model. This is regularly used in treatment centers, in therapy sessions. It is a heavily researched theory, and I will share some resources about this specifically. But what's important to know here is we know that people change slowly, right? We have lots of research on that. If you've ever quit smoking, for example, or know someone that's quit smoking, this will all sound really familiar, right? It's a long process. It takes a lot of attempts to get it right? Very few people quit smoking on the first try successfully, right? So that sort of change happens through a cyclical process. Likely there's sort of multiple attempts. And there is this sense of what we call ambivalence, right? This idea that people might want to change and not want to change at the same time, right? And that's like totally reasonable, right? Like people could sort of know that things are not working, that they need to do something differently, and they're really not ready to do anything about it. And so sort of people's ambivalence might fluctuate one way or the other, maybe multiple times sort of during the day. Sometimes I ask my clients, like what stage of change sort of on here they think they are. And it's like, well, at 9 o'clock I was here and at noon I was here, right? That they can really sort of have different feelings about how they want to make a change, even like sort of in one day, right? This does not like happen very quickly, that sort of people resolve that type of ambivalence. So you can sort of see here in the contemplation stage where the person's saying, well, maybe. Really, that's sort of like what ambivalence looks like. Yeah, maybe I should do something, right? If anybody's ever tried to convince you to make some type of lifestyle change, right? Changing your diet or getting a gym membership, you can really think about like, yeah, I've been thinking about, right, making that change to sort of, yeah, I should get up and go jogging every morning. I'm going to think about that probably for a while before I actually make that change, right? The same thing is true when somebody's thinking about changing their drug or alcohol use, because it's working for them in some ways. It's not working for them in all the ways, right? It's causing a lot of consequences, but it's also providing some type of relief, some type of reinforcement, particularly like we talked previously about like a lot of reinforcement sort of neurobiologically for them. And so getting them to really kind of come to this place where they're in preparation, like I need to actually make a change. What do I do? Takes quite a bit of time for most people. So this is just another view kind of the same process or the same stages of change, but this is sort of to show you that it is often sort of cyclical, that people can enter and exit at any point in time. People typically with any type of behavior change start out in pre-contemplation and then sort of move on. Now, what I will say is this has relapse as a stage. I do not agree with that. I think relapse does not have to be part of anybody's recovery journey, and relapse can actually happen at any point in time along this sort of cycle, right? Somebody could have a recurrence of substance use regardless of where they are within sort of these stages. Okay. So what I want to do now is talk about these stages in a little bit more depth, what they look like, what should be happening in treatment if you have somebody that you're concerned about, and then also what interventions can a family member use. So if you're thinking about either a client or a loved one or a friend, you can really think about where they are and then what might be useful in terms of your behavior. So pre-contemplation is really when somebody doesn't see a problem, right? I have no intention of changing, right? This is like denial, right? Sort of total defensiveness. I don't know what you're talking about. Like, get off my back, right? They really are not aware of the consequences that you're experiencing or they're experiencing. Clinically, what should be happening if somebody's either entering treatment or in therapy or in counseling or working with a recovery coach is their task is really raising awareness. So helping that individual sort of evaluate their behavior, a lot of self-exploration and a lot of psychoeducation. So education about addiction, brain disease, things like that really are what's happening in treatment when somebody is in pre-contemplation. We don't want to mismatch. So if somebody is here in pre-contemplation and they go into a treatment setting and we start explaining to them, about how they can stop using substances and how they need relapse prevention, and they're like, what are you talking about? I don't even have a problem, right? So we don't want to mismatch sort of where somebody is with what we're doing. The same is true for family members. So if you are sort of in a relationship with somebody that is in pre-contemplation, the recommendation here is going to be seeking out your own support. I know that's not what people want to hear, right? You want me to tell you something else, but really that's what you can do at this point, primarily, is those self-care strategies. Looking for your own support groups, your own professional counseling, like I mentioned, practicing self-care, a lot of education. You are here participating in this series, right? So learning about addiction, learning about co-occurring disorders, with what types of things tend to go with addiction, and learning about recovery, right? Really educating yourself so that you understand can take a lot of the shame sort of out of your experience. I know this seems sort of also counterintuitive, but focusing on the relationship is also one of the best things you can do when someone is in pre-contemplation. Any good sort of counselor or therapist is going to focus on building a relationship with somebody when they're in pre-contemplation, right? They're not going to confront them and make them defensive. They are just going to try to get to know them and build a relationship. And I recommend the same for family members, to really look for any opportunities to strengthen the relationship outside of substance use or addictive behavior. And so really focusing on connection, because we know that connection and family relationships is really what motivates people to go into treatment. And if we cut that off here, we really lose that opportunity. But if we cut off the connection when somebody is in pre-contemplation and highly defensive, we lose that really as sort of a weight to try to get them into treatment. So we actually want to really maintain that relationship and strengthen it with them, and look for opportunities within that to do it when they're not using, right? To really connect with them. This is also a time to start learning and implementing some new communication strategies, specifically around sort of reinforcing behaviors that you do like, or how to ask open-ended questions. We don't have time today to sort of go into some of those communication strategies. I'm hoping that next time we will have be able to go into some of that, but I have some resources on that as well. In this stage, if you are trying to express any concerns, you really want to do it with compassion and with permission. And so what that looks like is, again, when the person is not intoxicated, not when you're arguing, not when there is a crisis, but in other moments, asking like, could I give you some feedback, or are you open to hearing something, right? And sharing concerns that you might have. And really going back to focusing on your own behaviors and learning how to use positive reinforcement, right? So how to really connect and reinforce any times that they are making different choices, where they are not using, where they're showing up the way that you want them to, really reinforcing those behaviors. So contemplation is sort of our next stage. And what this looks like is really that ambivalence that I talked about. So somebody might be, yeah, like I know there might be a little bit of a problem, but I don't really know that I need to do anything about it. Yeah, maybe I drink too much, but like I'm not one of those people. I don't need to go to AA or anything like that, right? This is what it might sound like. They're considering some type of change, maybe not the change that you wish they would make, but they are sort of starting to have some awareness, which is a great sign, right? That sort of developing awareness is really important, and we want to sort of cultivate that. So what that might look like in therapy or treatment is trying to resolve that ambivalence, right? So trying to really get somebody to move to the other side where like they're no longer feeling ambivalent. They know they need to make a change, and they know that this is not working for them. And so that looks a lot like developing sort of some discrepancy between their values and their behavior. So what they say is important to them versus what's happening. What that looks like for family members is continuing to practice self-care and modeling engagement in recovery and professional supports. So hopefully in the previous stage, you have gotten involved in some type of professional support or mutual aid organization. And here, keep doing that, right? If you haven't already, you would get involved now, right? But we are practicing that, we are taking care of ourselves, and we are modeling that. Hopefully we're learning new communication and reinforcement skills that we can actually utilize, especially as we start to see that somebody might be more open to hearing that type of feedback and support. We can sometimes provide some support around resolving that ambivalence. Again, that comes with reinforcing sort of behaviors that we like and we want to see. Also, developing confidence. So a lot of times when people are in contemplation, not moving forward out of that is sort of related to lack of confidence, right? Like, yeah, maybe this is a problem, but I don't think I can do anything about it. So we really want to offer hope and confidence that like change is totally possible. We believe in them. We're going to be here to help them, whatever they decide to do. And another strategy here that I think can be very useful is a suggestion for an assessment or consultation. If somebody is in contemplation, it can feel really overwhelming to say like, and now you need to go to rehab. That's terrifying, right? What do you mean I'm never going to have a drink again or drug again, right? I think it can be a really nice sort of way to help somebody sort of get their foot in the door is just to recommend, say, well, would you be open for getting an assessment, right? There's plenty of places here in town that will do some type of consultation and assessment around somebody's addictive behaviors or psychiatric symptoms and give some recommendations, right? That's a very non-threatening, let's just see what this person has to say. Let's get an assessment. You probably know what that person is going to say, but that is a sort of a non-threatening way to kind of open the door versus leading with, great, you think you have a little bit of a problem, how about we go to treatment, right? All that's actually going to do is like entrench the person more in their defensiveness. You're not hearing from them, I'm ready to make a change. So don't suggest residential or IOP or anything like that yet when they're in contemplation. Preparation, though, which comes next, we really sort of start to hear what we call change talk. I am ready to make a change. Now, I don't know that people really come and say that. Occasionally, they might say, I need to go to treatment, right? Or I need help, right? Is what it might sound like. They've really started to think, I've got to do something. They don't know like what to do about it, right? Like, or how to do anything about it yet necessarily. We might see people sort of starting to do some research or looking into options. They might be like willing to try out a meeting. In a clinical setting, really the tasks here is really helping the client or the individual sort of choose sort of the pathway, right? What do they need to do? What are some change strategies? What will this change actually look like? And still a lot of strengthening commitment to change. Hopefully we've resolved a lot of ambivalence, but even here, people are sort of like, yeah, I think I should stop using, but I don't have to stop using everything, right? Right? I'm just gonna stop some of my substance use. So here we're still gonna get a little bit of ambivalence. Like, what does this really look like long term? So practicing self-care here continues to be important for the family. We are still trying to model engagement in recovery and professional supports. We are starting to maybe come up with what are some resources. We might be able to share some of those resources with our loved one now. We might be able to support them in learning new skills, really reinforcing and like being a cheerleader for any small changes. I think family members are really burnt out by the time somebody's here in preparation. And if somebody has sort of a setback, we get really discouraged, but we just want to really be sort of encouraging of any positive changes when somebody is, they're sort of like dabbling in change, right? And so we want to kind of really reinforce that and support that. We can also try to remove any barriers or obstacles, right? So if they have obstacles about, oh, I can't go to treatment or therapy because of childcare or because of my dog or because of cost, right? I'll only go if I can take my pet. I hear that one a lot. We can try to sort of come up with strategies for helping remove any of those obstacles that are in the way, or I can't make the meeting. Let me help you get there, right? Whatever it might be. So a lot of hand holding, a lot of patience at this stage. Okay, action. I think a lot of times in those other stages, family members like get ahead of themselves. Professionals do this too. Get ahead of themselves and assume like, oh, they want to stop using. They must be in action. No, like it takes like a long time to get here. It takes months to get to action. So they've actually made some changes. That doesn't mean they're great, right? It doesn't mean everything is fine. But they are maybe kind of excited about some of these changes. Sometimes in action, especially early action, we might see a lot of overconfidence, right? People really thinking, oh, I've got this now. I think family members can kind of get overconfident as well when somebody is sort of in these early stages of action. They've stopped using, they have made some change. In a clinical setting, the idea here is really a lot of skills, right? Relapse prevention skills, right? Recovery maintenance skills, coping strategies, emotion management skills, and really action planning, right? So follow through. For family members here in an action stage, we're still going to practice self-care, and we're still going to go to our professional help, and we're still going to go to our support groups. We're going to now have opportunities to engage in recovery-oriented behaviors together, right? We are going to actually be sort of making these types of changes together. I'm here beside you. That might be going to meetings together. That might be sort of engaging in sober activities together, right? That might be going to family therapy together. This is also a time to follow up on professional recommendations. Likely, if they did go to treatment of some kind, there's recommendations, right? A lot of times people get home, everybody's, yeah, and then 6 months after treatment, oh, like that problem is over. We don't need to be worried about that anymore. And this is the time to really follow through on any actual recommendations that were made. We can also really look at sort of expanding social support networks, particularly sort of sober support networks, still being incredibly patient and supportive around using new skills, right? We talked about previously, like 18 months for the brain to start healing, right? So if somebody's in action stage, like 6 months after they've stopped using, right, we've still got a long way to go before their sort of relapse rates are down, and they're still stumbling with a lot of those skills, right? So we're doing a lot of, this is why we need the self-care. This is why we need our support, right? Because we're still going to have to be incredibly patient. And then again, continuing to try to remove any of those like obstacles or objections to recovery. And the final stage that we have here is maintenance. Maintenance doesn't happen until sort of after 6 months of behavior change. So they really have to be in action for 6 months before we're talking about maintenance. And this is really where somebody is made a lot of changes, right? Hopefully they're actively involved in some type of recovery pathway. They've got a sponsor, they've got a mentor, they're engaging in therapy or follow-up, they're seeing their physician, right? And really what's happening in treatment at this point is they're still developing and implementing skills and really planning for managing setbacks. And I also think here planning for managing a relapse, which I know can sound a little bit sort of scary and counterintuitive, but actually what we should be doing as professionals and family members A good treatment program is going to help them have a plan for managing a relapse. And that looks like, who will they call, right? In that moment, how will they get back to their recovery goal as quickly as possible? What we don't want to do as a family is create such high expectations that when they do have a setback, they're so filled with shame that they can't come to us. So there's got to be somebody on the team within the inner circle that they can go to when this plan doesn't work. Because at some point in time, the research shows us, right, with relapse rates of 40 to 60%, that at some point in time, that plan is not going to work for that individual. It takes most people multiple tries to get it right. And so we're still going to be practicing self-care. We're still going to be engaging in recovery-oriented behaviors, hopefully together, following up on those professional interventions, reinforcing their change, and discussing what is the plan, right? What will happen if this isn't going well? People sort of don't want to talk about that. They hope it won't happen. And then it creates really a lot of shame and isolation for when it does. And then we're still going to be reinforcing sort of positive behaviors. I'm going to stop here because this is a lot of information, and I do want to leave maybe a few minutes for any questions. Yeah, so the question was about sort of family weeks and aftercare. Most treatment centers, like if somebody actually goes to rehab or residential treatment or something like that, is going to have either like a family day, a family week. That is a lot of education for the family. Lots and lots of education, likely groups, right? And some family therapy. Every center does it a little bit different, but anywhere good is going to have family therapy and some type of family involvement, because that really does predict the outcomes. And so I strongly recommend taking advantage of any family resources that are offered, and continuing family therapy afterwards. You know, if somebody's in treatment for 30 days and you get, 2 family sessions, you're not really unpacking much in those, right? That is not where most of the work is going to be done, right? Likely by the time somebody goes to treatment, the dysfunction within the family system has sort of evolved over years, and it will take months or years of therapy, ongoing outpatient of family therapy to address a lot of those things. So like family therapy, family weeks is a good place to sort of start that process and learn and connect with other families, and then continue that. So in terms of like maintenance and thinking about aftercare, most treatment centers are also going to make a lot of recommendations about aftercare. They've likely got some type of aftercare program, an alumni program, a recovery management program. I highly, highly recommend anything they offer. Sometimes those programs are free and you can participate in those post-discharge. Sometimes there might be a cost associated with them, but the outcomes on post-discharge support, things like recovery maintenance and alumni programs, are excellent. So I cannot stress that enough. If we're thinking about maintenance doesn't start until 6 months or more, right? It's not like go to treatment for 30 or 45 days and then like go to 90 and 90 and like all of a sudden everything is better, right? That really is not going to solve the problem. It is a lot of ongoing work and really maintaining some of those changes. So take advantage of and look for sort of anything post-discharge, a minimum of 90 days of treatment, followed by some type of, or not necessarily residential treatment for 90 days. Let me clarify that. 90 days of some type of continuous, that might just be therapy, that might be supportive outpatient or intensive outpatient, but some type of continuum for 90 days. Really, we see a lot better outcomes in terms of treatment, particularly when people sort of stay connected and get involved in an aftercare program. Such a great question, is sort of like not taking on too much responsibility. So all of the family interventions listed here are just things you could do, not that you have to do. What I would say is probably the most important thing for a family member to do is to take care of themselves. Because any of those other things on the list of family interventions will not be possible if you're not taking care of yourself, right? So taking care of yourself, like being connected and supported, is going to allow you to maybe sort of use other tools and strategies, but you ultimately cannot sort of solve the problem, right? Even as a helping professional, we kind of have to like surrender that we cannot control what somebody else does either, right? There really is a dangerous assumption that somehow we can control another person's behavior. Yeah, awesome. The question was about how to focus on the relationship when somebody might actively be using, right? It doesn't necessarily look like enabling, right? But it does look like for finding windows of opportunity where we can connect, right? So windows of opportunity maybe where they haven't used, right? They haven't used that day, or we're interacting with them and they are being appropriate, right? We've asked them to show up somewhere and they do show up. And then we really like reinforce that, right? Almost like you would with a kid, right? Like you have shown up the way, thanks so much for being here. Like I had asked you to come and I'm so glad that you did come, right? This is really important to me and really meaningful for me that you came when I had asked you to, right? That's what it might look like. Or inviting them to do something at a time they won't be using, right? And actually showing up, and if they can keep that commitment. So it looks like creating opportunities, even if they're very small windows. It doesn't mean that you have to enable. And then if they can't meet those expectations, then you're not, then you don't have to reinforce that, if that makes sense. It's really looking for ways to engage positively, even if it's a very tiny, versus constantly being engaged negatively. Because I think that is what happens, right? When somebody is dealing with any kind of like behavioral health challenge, what ends up happening is we're constantly engaging with them in negative ways, right? And that's what the relationship becomes about. So it's trying to move away from that being the central thing connecting us or dictating our relationship to any other opportunity that we have to connect or be in relationship with them. Does that answer the question a little bit better? It is really, really hard. That's why we want to take care of ourselves first. And that might mean like I invited you to go on a hike and you showed up and you've been using. I'm sorry, I don't want to go on this hike anymore. You've been using. And that's when we do set a boundary, right? Maybe we could try again one day that works better for you, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it doesn't mean sort of letting go of all our limits and all of our boundaries, right? We still can have those. We can have those with compassion, but we certainly don't have to continue to engage with them in that moment if they can't do what we've asked. Yeah. These are the three resources I would recommend the most. This Beyond Addiction book is definitely my favorite, and then these two brief sort of guides. The parents one does have a digital version as well, like an online workshop that you can do, but these would definitely be my three favorite things that really use like a sort of motivational, behavioral, scientific approach for family members, not just a tough love approach.